Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows Compiler. Today we will look again at using the Windows Form Designer and handling both date and dynamic controls on our form. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have a dialog containing a number of controls, allowing our user to enter data into these controls and then press the Submit button. We have added on validation in the event handler, the callback function, to allow us to ensure that all the fields which are to be mandatory have indeed been filled in. However, today we're going to go a little further and add two more elements to our form. The first is a requirement coming down from the HR department. Of the departments which our user can select to which the new start is going to join, the requirement that HR have submitted is that all departments should have a shift working pattern, with the exception of the HR department. So what needs to happen is when a user selects the HR department, the working pattern sections of our dialog should disappear and not require to be validated. So let's go ahead and do that first. Back to the code. So in order to implement this requirement, we'll need to go into the event handler, the callback function. In our callback function, these are the sections of code which are executed when the user interacts with the dialog. And we want to put an event in to handle the selection of the department. At the moment, as you will see, there is no event for selecting department. So what we will do first of all at the beginning of this particular function is we will add a local variable to store the department name. And next we will create the event itself that allows us to trap the user clicking on the department drop-down combination box. And here is our event on the combo department drop-down. This is exactly like trapping a button click. We're checking the control message to see if it is equal to BN clicked, or the value of 1. If that's the case, a user has selected something from this single selection department drop-down. So we will first use control get text, passing it two parameters, the dialog handle and the object handle, and we will pull the information that has been selected and place it within the department variable we have just created. We can then test that variable, and if it equals HR, we know the user has selected the HR department. So if that's the case, we want now to hide the two objects on screen which handle the working patterns. And we can do that quite easily by using the control hide command. I'm using the prefix command here to save a little bit of typing, as we have two objects we wish to hide. So it's control hide the dialog handle and then the handle of the object. We're hiding the label and the list box. So as the user could go in, select HR and then change their mind, we'll need to be able to put the list box back to visibility if something is subsequently selected that is not HR. So we will put in an else condition, where we will normalize the visibility of the two objects. So if we try running the application now, we'll see initially the working pattern list box does appear. If we select HR, then it now disappears. But if we go ahead and select one of the other departments, it will reappear. So we've successfully implemented the first part of HR's requirement, that the working pattern section of the dialog only appears when the department is something other than HR. However, as you can probably guess, this is going to affect our validation routine. If we pick HR, and we fill the rest of the form in, and then hit the Submit button, it will quite rightly report that no working pattern has been picked, as we have not yet changed the validation section of our code to handle HR's new requirement. So let's go back to the code and make that change in the validation routine. So here we are now in the Validate Form section of the code, where the form is validated. We are already picking out the department information from the form. So we'll now have to test that department to see if it is indeed HR. So after the section where we validate the department, this is where we'll want to put our new code in. So we're testing the value stored in the department variable. If that's equal to HR, then we're going to mark our working pattern as HR full-time. And for all other departments, we can then go ahead and validate. So in this new section, we can now cut out this part of the code here and paste it in. So where the department equals HR, we will perform no check on the data sitting in the working pattern variable. Instead, we will set it to HR full-time. But for all other departments, we will check the working pattern as we did in the last video. If it is blank, we will display an error message to say no working pattern has been picked, and exit the function immediately. Otherwise, we will clear any error highlighting of the pattern and continue the code. Additionally, for HR, we will also put in a section to clear any highlighting that has already been done on a previous selection by the user. So let's try our code now and see how it runs. Select HR as the department and hit submit. It should display HR full-time with no error. If we then select another department and hit submit without filling in a working pattern, it should generate an error. If we then go back to HR and hit submit, it displays our details quite correctly. So we've handled the first requirement from HR. The working pattern, where the user selects one or more shifts, is now conditional on the department selected. For HR, that is not displayed, but for all other departments, it is. Now we move on to the second request from HR. They're now wanting a start date appearing on our form. So we're going to have to add a date control. So once more, back to the forms designer. So here is our form. We will create a little bit more room on our form to allow us space to add in a date control. And over on our toolbox, we can see all the controls that we can use. Now we have two. We have a date time picker control and a month calendar control. So we're going to use the date time picker control. And we will drag that up to an appropriate position on our form. As you will see, the date time control automatically defaults to the current date and time. As I'm in the UK, it's showing the UK date format, as in day, month, year. If you're using the US date format, it would of course show month, day, year. So we'll also need a title for this one. So this is going to be our start date. So we will also name our date control. And we will save our form back to the system. And we will see we now have two new controls on the source code. One for the label of the start date and one for the start date control itself. However, since we've added new controls to our form, we'll really need to set the tab order. So once more back to the Forms Designer. And if we click on the tab order editor at the top of the screen and go through the order we want the user to select different things on the screen. And that should now set the start date as the correct tab order. So let's run the application and just check that. So from our title, we go to name, to age, department, working pattern, and then to the start date. One of the advantages of using a date control is that it does a lot of the checking for you when it comes to validating a date. If I were to key in, say for example, a date that does not exist in December, like the 32nd, it will not take the 32nd of December. It will only accept dates which are valid. Additionally, you have a little drop down on the right hand side. giving you a view of the entire month. You can see the current day, and you can then select other dates just by clicking on them on the screen. If you click on the month, you can then pick a different month, or even a different year. So this particular control gives you a good bit of functionality without you having to write a single line of code. So we need to make the label bigger for this one, and we need to actually take the date information and put it onto our form feedback. So if we go first of all to the callback function, and we add the new label to our list of labels which we're handling for font size. In our validate routine, where we're picking up the information, we're going to need something to pick up the start date. Now, there are a number of ways of actually handling dates, as they're slightly different to the way you would handle other controls, as in it's not merely text stored in that control. So what we're going to do first of all is work out the current date in our event handler. So I have added 3 variables to the beginning of this function. So we're adding a variable called start date. I'm making this particular string a static variable. This means once the value has been set, the next time we enter this function, it will remember the value it had from the last time this function was executed. And I'm adding 2 additional variables as pointers. These are set up to allow you to handle notifications, so that your event handler is notified every time the user changes the value in the date variable. We'll get to that in a moment, but first we want to pick up the value of the current date. And we can do that quite easily by using PowerBasic's inbuilt PowerTime class. So we're setting up a local variable as an iPowerTime variable, and we're associating that with the PowerTime class. We can then use the today method to pick up today as a date. And we're populating our static variable, start date, with the date string. This date string is region aware, so if you're in a zone which has day, month, year as the date, that's the format that will go into our variable. If you're in a region which takes month, day, year, then that's the format we will use. So now we know the start date, what do we do next? Well, next we need to handle notifications. Every time this date control changes, it will send a notification to our event handler. So we need to set up a section of this code to handle notifications. And here is the section of code which will handle notifications. WM notify. There may be a number of objects on your form which notify you of things that are happening. So the first thing we want to do is to pick up this header pointer using the lower parameter of the callback function. This allows us to look for the ID from value. That way we can tell which control has actually sent the notification, in this case the start date. And then we can look to see what kind of code it has passed us back. In this case it's a date time change. The value has basically changed on our control. So since that's the case, we can then pick up on our next variable, populating it with the lparam value. And then we can make the start date equal to, in this case, the day, the month, and then the year. So we've now picked up the value from our date control. As this is stored within this callback function, it's usable in other parts of the code. When the user has selected the Submit button, we can then pass that value onto our validate form function as an extra parameter. So we will need now to amend our validate form function to add on this extra parameter. And there is our extra parameter start date. So within our validate form, we now know the start date that the user has selected. So next, we need to confirm with HR what the rules are for start dates. HR come back with 2 rules on this field. Firstly, the date the user selected cannot be in the past. So if the date is before the current date, then we will treat that as an error. So we'll put that piece of code in first. So as there's going to be more than one rule to apply to testing our date, we're going to use two variables here. One as a string, which will contain an error message to show to the user. The second is a true or false Boolean flag to say true if there's an error or false if there is not. So to save some time, I'm going to bring in a date functions library here. If we go to the beginning of our code, and we can put in our date functions library. And there it is. The date functions library is something we've been building on for quite some time. This has a number of very useful functions embedded in this library. Some of the previous videos have gone over these already. However, we're going to be using one of these functions, the addDays function, in a few moments. But initially, we're going to be using these three functions: the date number and date number UK and US formats. This will return a number for the date passed in. That way we can work out whether a date is before or after another date. We don't need to check the validity of a date, as the date control does all that for us. So back to the validate form. So first of all, we're going to test our start date against the current date. PowerBasic has a date dollar function which automatically returns the date in month, day, year format. I've created another function in a library called UKDate that quite simply takes date dollar and reformats it to the UK format. So if you're using the American date format, just substitute date dollar for this function. So using one of the functions, date number UK, in our new library, we can determine whether the start date is less than the current date. If that's the case, then we want to populate our error message to say the date is in the past. And since we have populated the error variable with a true value, then we can then test that and decide whether to display the details to the user and exit the function, or clear the error handling if the value is false. And for the output, we can add on our start date to the details passed back to the user. So if we run our application now, we'll see the date is the current date. So if we pick the HR department, and if we make the date sometime in the past, it should give us an error. So there we go. Our age is too young, so let's up the age. And there we go, our start date is in the past. So it's correctly picked up our date being before the current date. So if we move it to the current date, it should accept it quite happily now and display the start date. So we've met the first criteria passed to us by HR in the requirements. The start date cannot be before the current date. So we now have a second criteria from our HR department. In order to give them more time for users to be set up, they need a 7-day buffer. So if the user is starting, they cannot start until 7 days from today's date at the very earliest. So we'll have to move the goalpost slightly so that the validation handles that future date. So once more, back to the code. So since the 7-day limit could change in the future, I'm going to set that up as a constant at the beginning of our code. And there it is. I've called this constant starter buffer, the number of days buffer for new starters. So once more, back to the validation code. So in order to work out when this new buffer date is going to be, I'm going to create a new variable. And we'll call that new date. This is the start date plus the starter buffer. And in order to work out when that is, I'm going to use another function in our library called addDays. This new function will quite simply take three parameters. The first is the starter date. The second is the number of days to add or subtract from that date. And the final format is either going to be UK or US. This is necessary in order for the system to know which date format we're currently using. So this gives us our new date. We'll leave the check on the date number code in where it is, and we'll add some extra code in an else statement. And here is our else if statement. We're still using the date number UK function, taking the start date checking to see if it is less than the new date. If that's the case, then the start date is less than 7 days away. And we can change our error message to say start date is less than 7 days away and display this to our user. We're setting the error flag to be true. So if we try running our application now, and we put our details in, and we'll pick a different department this time, shift in and hit submit. Now the start date is less than 7 days away. If we move it back to an old date, it will tell us it's in the past. If we advanced less than 7 days, it tells us it's less than 7 days away. And if we go to either 1 week from now, it will be accepted, or beyond 1 week from now, and it will still be accepted. So in summary, what we've achieved today is twofold. We have made the form somewhat dynamic, in that the working pattern section of the dialog is only visible if the user has not selected HR. As soon as HR is selected from the departments list, the label and the list box for working patterns disappears. Not only that, it is no longer validated while the department is HR. Secondly, we have added a new date control to our form to allow our users to enter the start date. We've added additional validation to that to ensure that if the user does select a date in the past, they get that as an error and they cannot proceed. We've also added a 7-day buffer, so that if the date the user has actually entered is before 7 days from today, then again they cannot proceed. This will be easy to amend should at some point in the future that HR decide that 7 days is not necessary and 4 is all they will need. A simple recompile of our application and this will be implemented. Hopefully you'll find these approaches to dialog handling useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching today's video. Please feel free to click on the link in the description below to discover more videos.